right, good morning to everyone. How is everyone doing? Peachy. At least you're not stinky. I can peachy. Okay, these are the other side. If you have the outline from last week, you just flip it over. We're going to talk about the parable of the talents. If you don't have one, do you need one? Does anybody need one? Let me see. I'm trying to give you about half of them. You're welcome. Anybody else? All right. Well, parable of the talents. Thank you, sir, if you pass those down. Anybody? All right. Matthew 25. We begin actually in the first of the 24th chapter. If you recall the context there. In the 24th chapter, there's a question. There are actually two questions that are asked. And the questions pertain to the end of time, the end of Jerusalem, and the end of time. Those are the two questions that are asked. Jesus deals with, in the 24th chapter, we set this up last week, so I'm not going to spend just a whole lot of time unless you want to. But in the 24th chapter, Jesus begins by answering the first question with regards to the destruction of Jerusalem. And as he gets to about verse 36, he says, but, there's a contrast there. In other words, but, here's the second answer, the second question. The second question deals with the end time and the second coming of the Lord. As we looked last week, you deal with that in the 24th chapter. You get into the 25th chapter, you find one of the parables, and that's what we're studying, our parables. I think you all remember that. But in the first bit, the first, say, 13 verses of Matthew 25, what you have is the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins. The 5 wise, 5 foolish virgins. And we talked about that parable last week. And so now we're ready for the parable with regards to the parable of the talents. This is a well-known parable, to say the least. If I were to talk to you and ask you about the judgment scene, what's going to happen on that day, you could probably tell me a lot. We might talk about, if you think about the judgment, we might think about the sights and the scenes and the sounds of the judgment day. What's going to happen? We know that with regards to sounds, that Paul says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, that there be the voice of the archangel, the trump of God. We know that there's going to be a loud, if you will, sounding the end of time and the beginning of eternity. We know that the elements, Peter says, will pass away with great noise. And we know with regards to the sights, we see the Lord coming again. We see him coming in the cloud, and we see him coming again. We see the dead rising forth from their grave, if you will, and the living changed, and all standing before the judgment seat of Christ. And we see all of that, and we understand then what's going to take place with regards to standing before the Lord and giving account of our life and being judged by those things that we did, said, and took part in. And the 5 wise and 5 foolish virgins of Matthew 25, Jesus is dealing with the idea that you need to be ready because you don't know when the Lord's coming back. You don't know when all that's going to take place. Now, he doesn't deal with all the sight sounds of the judgment in Matthew 24, but in Matthew 25, he begins by saying, he'd be ready. And what he's then transitions to, and beginning in verse 14, is this second parable, the parable of the talents. And the overriding principle that he is trying to teach those to whom he is speaking is that not only do you need to be prepared, but you need to be prepared for the coming of the Lord, knowing that you're going to be judged on whether you used what you had. Now that's important. That in many ways is the crux of this parable. Have you made preparation for that day? Let's begin by looking in verse 14. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling into a far country who called his own servants and delivered his goods. Here's a man, evidently has quite a lot, and he's going to be traveling. He's going on vacation for a while. He's going on an extended leave of time, and so he calls his servants together, and he's going to entrust them. They're going to be stewards. He's going to entrust them with his things. It's a lot of faith, isn't it? Will my stuff be here when I get back? Do you ever think about that when you go on vacation? I do. When I go on vacation, I don't tell a lot of people that I'm going. Try not to, because I don't want them to know. Why? Because when I get back, I want my stuff to be there. Well, he's going on an extended vacation. He has evidently servants. And so he gives, if you will, his servants what would be considered the responsibility of stewardship. You might say, well, servants really always have that. Well, yes and no. Their responsibility, though, look at what he says, verse 15. To one, he, the master, if you will, gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1. Now, we talked last week, we just sort of, since we had a few minutes, we talked about how that a talent, and it's there on your sheet, how that 1 talent is 6,000 denarii, and that, or denarius, really, denarius, plural, but that or denarius is singular, denarii is plural, that 1 talent is 6,000 denarii, and 1 day's wages is denarius, singular, one of these. So you would say 1 talent equals 6,000 days of work. Now you think about that. He didn't just give them just a few dollars. He'd say, when I come back, here's what's going to be. But he gave 1 5, to another 2, and another 1. And we think, well, that's odd. Why didn't he give them all the same? Well, look what it says. To each according to his own ability. In other words, the 5-talent man could handle 5 talents. 2-talent man could handle 2 talents. The 1-talent man could handle 1 talent. It makes sense, doesn't it? Some folks are good at this, and some folks are good at that. But most folks aren't good at both this and that, right? And so each man has an ability. We all do. We all have certain things we can do and certain things we can't do, and certain and amounts that we can handle. You can throw a lot of work on some people, and some people you kind of have to baby them along. Well, these individuals were given 5, 2, and 1 based upon how they could handle that responsibility, could handle what they were given. And it says, and immediately he went on a journey. So he left. Verse 16, and remember, this is a story that Jesus is telling. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. So the 5-talent man went out and he did really what he should have done. He used his 5 talents. Now, it doesn't really matter. We could sit here and say, well, how did he gain 5 more talents? We don't know. And that's not the import of the story. That's not the reason, if you will, that Jesus is telling the story. He's trying to show the importance of using what you have, being a good steward. He says the 5-talent man, he gained 5 more. And then likewise, verse 17, who had received 2 gained 2 more also. So the 5-talent man gained 5 more. The 2-talent man went out, he gained 2 more. He put his to use. He put his to work. And then verse 18 says, but he who received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. The individual that had 1 went and he dug a hole. Now, remember, in first centuries, Bank of Jerusalem, nothing yet. They didn't have it. And so this was a common way of taking care of your money. It's like you probably got some in your stock drawer. or probably wished you had some in your sock drawer. But I don't. I don't have any in my sock drawer. Don't want any in my sock drawer. I want it to be doing something. And so, needless to say, though, this man, what does he do? Well, it says that he went and he dug in the ground. That was common. You didn't have banks. You didn't have Bank of Jerusalem, so you went and you hid your money. He hid his money. Excuse me. And hid what, and I want you to see something. Look in verse 18 again. He went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. Did you catch that? He still saw it not as his to use. He saw it still as the Lord's money. It's his. It's not mine. It's his. Now you might say, well, that makes sense, and that's a good idea. Everything that's ours is really not ours. It's the Lord, yes, but it's ours to use as we see fit. That's the difference. And so he sees it as the Lord's money. And then verse 19 says, after a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So it came the day of reckoning. It came the time in which we're going to see, okay, what did you do? How did you handle what you had? And so he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents besides them. So he's giving an assessment of what I've done. You gave me 5. I'm bringing back not only the 5 that you gave me, but I'm giving you the 5 that I gained with it, which is an interesting concept. Think about it. If you just kind of think about it quickly, that he would give all of it back to the master. That's the story that Jesus is telling. His Lord, verse 21, said to him, well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And it says, you've done well. The assessment of him is that he's praised. He said, well done. You've done a good job. You've done, not just an admirable thing, but you have done that which is wonderful. And so he is praised for what he has done. But notice what he says. He calls him good and faithful. You're not only good, but you're faithful. You're faithful to me. You are a reliable, trustworthy individual upon whom I can rely, upon whom I can count. And notice then that he says, you were faithful over a few things. Well, we would think you think about 5 talents, that's a lot there. That's a lot. But he says, you're faithful over a few things. I'm going to make you ruler over many. I'm going to set you up in a bigger way. That's kind of the way I look at it in our terminology. I'm going to set you up bigger. I'm going to give you more. I'm going to give you more responsibility, which he might have been saying, well, gee, thanks. I really like that. But okay, so I'm going to make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. And he who also, verse 22, who had received 2 talents, came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I have gained 2 more talents besides them. Now, his answer, interestingly enough, his answer is the same to the Lord or to the master as the 5-talent man. If you look, it's the same word. Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents, except for 2 talents and 5 talents. I gained 2 more besides them. And once again, he's praised. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I'll make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. But then he says in verse 24, then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you were a hard man. I knew you were hard. I knew you were difficult, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. In other words, I knew you were an exacting man and you expected a great deal. You expected a lot from what you had entrusted us with. Now, he's not denying the fact that he's been entrusted with something. He's not denying the fact that he probably should have done something. But what he did, notice what it says. He says, verse 25, I was afraid. I was afraid. fear causes us to do a lot of things, and more importantly, fear causes us not to do a lot of things. If we're afraid, oh, I'm afraid I just won't do that. I'm afraid. Have any of you thought about going up to Gatlinburg and walking on that glass across the mountains? I really haven't thought about it. My wife thought about it for about 2 seconds when we were up there a couple of years ago. She said, "No, I'm not doing that." Okay. Didn't really want to pay the outrageous price just to walk across glass on a mountain myself. But needless to say, fear will cause us not to do. I was afraid. And so we don't speak up, we don't do, we just sit there. Fear really is paralyzing. It's paralysis. And it's real. Let's be sure. Let's don't say, well, fear is a terrible thing and you should have had faith. Let's understand, yeah, you should have had faith. But fear still is a reality. And sometimes in order to overcome it, you have to take very small baby steps. Preacher, we've got to have faith. We do. We don't need to be afraid. We need to venture out. But we've got to understand that those that have that fear, it's real to them. And being real to them, it takes a lot for them to overcome it. And so we have to respect them and work with them, but work very slowly and very cautiously. But notice and think about this man. He says, I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Now, we could commend the man, right? He doesn't go out and blow it. He doesn't go out and give it away. He doesn't go out and throw it away. He doesn't go out and say, hey, I've got this. Who wants it? He did nothing. That's the problem. He just let it sit there. And so he says, look, which is interestingly enough, because that's what the 5-talent man, the 2-talent man said. Look. There you have what is yours. Now, he tries to put a positive spin on it, right? Who wouldn't? His positive spin was this. Didn't lose it. Still got it. Still yours. Didn't gain anything out of it, but you didn't lose it. And then, if you look what he says with regards to verse 26, his Lord answered and said to him, you wicked and lazy servant. The other 2 servants had been praised. They were pleasing. This man is criticized. Wicked, lazy, slothful. You hadn't done what you should have done. You knew, and notice what he says, you knew that I reap where I have not, you knew I was an exacting master. You knew I would expect you to do something. You knew that I would come back wanting more. He says, it's not a matter of, well, you thought or I might have. You knew that this is what was going to happen. And so he says, verse 27, so you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. He said, you should have put it to use. Well, they weren't banks like what we think of, with safety deposit boxes and, vaults and things like that. They were traders. It doesn't gain anything. It's like putting it in a hole. Invest with. There were brokers. There were gems that you could invest it with and gain more. I think Pat just said she invested her money with somebody else. No, he didn't. I'm walking away from that.
So that almost sounds like he's stealing.
No, it's just that he's exacting. You expect me. You expect. I expect something from you. I expect you to do something. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. These are his servants. These are not. Yeah. These are not. Right. Right. That's right.
Knew that they were diminished, and he expected diminishment.
Sure.
He expected something.
Expected something. Very true. Very true.
Handed out the money.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. That's why he did it the way he did it. Yeah. Yeah.
Same as the young lawyer. It's so cheap.
Well, what comes to my mind is an adage my dad used to say everybody can't be chiefs. You got to have Indians as well. I think it's a good question, but you can't. Yeah, if you have everybody at fives, you're not gonna get much done. Yeah.
That word is the Greek word, talentos. I looked it up for a large sum of money, something. I did the math the other night, about $900,000, making a million. Depending on, you took a day to average work and you did it.
Well, if you did it like that.
Days, kind of crap, something 800 or 900 or $1 million. And, the word really means, it should mean to us a large sum of money.
Sure.
I can read that into talents because that word means something in English, but think about it. We spoke Spanish and you read that story. Somebody had paid us for a large sum of money. For a Spanish reader, it wouldn't mean anything for talent. Like your personal ability, like one person lays a window, one person can do plumbing or whatever, it wouldn't be that at all.
Right.
Really just limited to a large sum of money.
Right. We're gonna make the application here in a minute. But true. True. Anything else? Well, let's finish. He tells him, he says, verse 28, therefore take the talent from him and give it to him that has 10 talents. That seems unfair. You're going to take away from him that, has nothing and make sure he's sure he has nothing. But at the same point in time, too, the principle, as we're going to see in just a second, the principle is use what you got. That's the principle Jesus is teaching. But anyway, so he says, take what you have, give to the 10 talent man, and goes on verse 29, for to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But for him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away, and cast the unprofitable servant into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so he says here, you need to do something. He says, all right. I'm sorry, that's true. We have one with a hiccup up here. It means she's growing. That's what my dad always said. So, but cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. So verse 30 has the application really of the unprofitable servant, the servant that didn't do what he was supposed to do or didn't do what he should have done, what he needed to do with what he had, is cast into outer darkness representing hell. And so you look at the parable and you say, man, that's a good parable. And it is about money. But the principle, it goes far deeper than that. Far deeper than that. The principle is the idea of preparing. Remember the first parable we talked about in this chapter last week. Preparing for the coming. make sure in your preparation that you do what you can with what you have. That's key, because then I want you to think about what's next. Look in verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, he'll sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And then keep reading. I'm not going to read it all, because you all can read, but that's the part. Those are the verses that talk about Jesus says, I was naked and you clothed me. I was hungry and you fed me. And when did we see you like this? Well, as much as you've done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. Context helps us understand what Jesus is trying to teach. He's talking about the second coming of the Lord. But in talking about the second coming of the Lord, he says, be prepared. And how you make preparation is that you take what you have and you use it. And you use it to the best of your ability. Hold your finger there in this text. And I want you to go to a passage. I want you to go to the book of 1 Corinthians. Well, no, I'll tell you what. Let's go to Romans 12. Let's just start there. Romans 12. It is true. We can't look at this parable and say, well, this is a parable about money. It is. But the principle is, the principle of using the money to gain more can be applied to the principle of using the gifts that God has given you, the abilities that God has given you, and use them for the glory of God. That's what Jesus, I believe, is trying to teach in this parable. Within a congregation, we'll just kind of put it within that scope. Within a congregation, there are people with various abilities, ministries, we might call them. And this is what they can do. This is the talents. Some have the talent to cook. And so what can they do? Well, they can fix food and take it to the sick, and they can take it to those that are bereaved, or they can take it to the folks that are going through a hard time, or they can take it to a young mother that's working and got small children and just needs help a little bit along the way, or they can take it to somebody that doesn't have, fix some food and take it. Well, there are some people though that write beautiful notes. I mean, they can sit down and they have good penmanship, and they've got the ability to have words, wonderful flowing words, and they can sit and write a note of encouragement. Then there's the other individual that has the ability to go out and work. And so when things need to be done and they see maybe a widow that needs some help, or they see a single mother that needs help, or they see somebody that's just down on their luck and they're able to help them by working. Or maybe there are others that within a congregation, they have the ability just to make money. I mean, that's really their skill. And so what can they do? Well, they can give to the contribution to help pay for the ministries that are going on within a congregation, and they can give to help the sick and the so forth and so on. And well, we've got some that, really because of health or because of abilities, they can pray. That's about all they can do. If they get to church, that's good, that's well, but all they can do is pray. Then they pray. Well, they've got some that, man, they know how to use that telephone. They can burn that telephone up. They're on it constantly. Well, good. Call the members of the church. Call those that need encouragement. It has really come to my attention. I've always thought about it. Let me back up. I'd always thought about it, but it just came to my attention this week again, how that as we grow older, we lose our circles of socialization. We retire. So what happens? Our work friends, we don't see anymore. And our habits, our circles, if you will, they change. They diminish and they change. And what we need are things that create socialization amongst folks that are advancing in years. And that's why, I used to kid about, when I got a little older, I don't mind going to a nursing home until somebody said, yeah, and they stick you with enemas and all these. And I said, well, maybe I don't want to go. But I always talked about, I thought I'd like to go. Suzanne gone and me at an advanced age and enjoy the socialization. Don't know that I'd enjoy the bingo because, they play bingo 10 times a day, 7 days a week. But it's not, I don't have anything against bingo. I just don't want to play that much. But here's the point, getting back really to the point. The point is, use what you have. Look in Romans 12. Romans 12, we often think, when we think of Romans 12, we think of the first two verses. Present yourselves as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. But then he says, beginning in verse 3, he says, don't think too highly of yourself. And then he says in verse 4, for as we have many members in one body, and all members do not have the same function. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. So he says, everybody has a different gift. Everybody has a different talent. Everybody has a different ability. He doesn't condemn the fact that we have different abilities or talents. Paul, by inspiration, is telling us it's all right. We're not a cookie cutter society. We're not cookie cutter people. God didn't make us all alike. But I want you to notice beginning in verse 6. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, let us use them. In other words, whatever ability you have, use it. And he goes through some of the abilities of the first century. If prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Or ministry, let us use it in our ministering. He who teaches in teaching. He who exhorts in exhortation. He who gives with liberality. He who leads with diligence. He who shows mercy with cheerfulness. And then he goes on. I kind of like even verse 9, even though I think there's a change of thinking in verse 9, but he says, let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good, be kindly affectioned. And he kind of, I think in some ways, he kind of expands on what he's just said. But he says, whatever ministry you have, whatever ability you have, use it. Now, turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, 13, and 14. These are the spiritual gifts, and we'll not spend a great deal of time belaboring the point, but I want you to kind of just be familiar with this and think about it along this line. These gifts were for a particular period of time and for a particular purpose, and that is for the glorification of God, for the building of the church. They were limited by God from the standpoint of being used in order to edify. In other words, okay, you have these abilities. Be sure you use them to edify the church. Be sure you use them to build up the church. And then he goes, especially in the 14th chapter of 1 Corinthians, and he talks about just make sure that the things that you do are for edification. And he goes on, matter of fact, he even says, beginning in verse 2, he who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God, for no one understands him. However, in the Spirit he speaks mysteries. But he who prophesies speaks edification, exhortation, and comfort to men. He who speaks in a tongue edifies himself, but he who prophesies edifies the church. And so he's saying, use what you have for the glory of God. Now, having said that, go back now to the parable of the talents. Jesus is teaching. Whatever abilities you have, use them. The 5-talent man had the ability to handle 5 talents. And he was praised and found pleasing to his master because he used the talents that he had. The 2-talent man, now let's think about the 2-talent man for a minute. The 2-talent man didn't sit back and say, why didn't you give me 5 talents? Am I not as good as this guy? He didn't sit there and also say, why did you give me 2 talents? Why didn't you give me 1 talent and make it easier on me? You see, he doesn't criticize what he has. He's thankful for what he has, evidently. And so he puts it to use. And evidently, the master was correct in his assessment of the servant because he gained 2 more. He didn't gain 4 more. He had 4 altogether. But he gained as much as he was given. And so as much as you've been given, use it. That's true of this church as a whole. What can we do? Our responsibility is do what you can do. You know, we like the story of the lady in Mark chapter 14 that came and anointed the feet of Jesus. And basically the story as Mark tells it there is do what you can with what you have where you are. We like that story. And we like the story because it does present the principle of do what you can with what you have where you are. Same's true with the church. Same's true with each individual. Makes up the church. Do what you can with what you have where you are. Use what you have. Don't sit and say, well, I just got 1 talent. I'm not as good as that fellow. You know, there are some folks in church. When you come to worship, they can lead a song and they can pray and they can teach a class and they can preach a sermon. And they can do it all. And then there's some folks that say, you know, I can't. There's physical limitations and maybe there's emotional limitations that keep me from doing those things. That's fine. Maybe that's not your talent. But maybe your talent is going outside these doors and talking to somebody about the Lord. You have the ability to one-on-one speak to people. That's then your talent. You use it. So don't sit around and use an excuse. Well, I can't. Well, once again, I'm going to use another expression I was brought up on. Can't, never could. And so you have to have a can-do mentality. And so these are some of the principles. Another one is a second lesson that might be taught is ability plus opportunity equals responsibility. And we sort of already looked at that. But ability plus opportunity, that's my responsibility. Do what you can with what you have where you are. Excuse me. Anything else? Does anybody else have another lesson that they would think out of these verses? Yeah. He was afraid. Yeah. It's a good one.
And not hurting you can talent, but also that expect effort.
Absolutely. It's a good point. Sure. Right. Yeah.
I had my pile of money. I really messed up. I only got half of it.
Yeah.
Here's what I tried to do. Here's where I've been wrong. Here's what I invested in. But the ship that I invested in, thankfully, trying to be good across the Mediterranean. And I lost half of your money. That would have been interesting. Wish there was a fourth guy here. I think that with the rest because that would have been convenient for it. Yeah, it was done.
So we just talked about parable of the prodigal son. Went out and lost everything. Not he thought to make bad investment. He just
It was worse than that, right?
oh yeah, he just doing what the father said. Sam,
Right.
you know, we never do know if he gave him anything else.
Gave him a ring and shoes.
I figured He said, the party's over.
There you go. There you go. Yeah.
They had the same mathematical requirement. They both doubled their money, maybe.
Yeah, but this one has so much more. One thing I've always wondered about is why he didn't get to the level 10 times.
Yes. Why not one with two?
Money you do was bad, and managed to bring back at.
Yeah, but the other ones at the same time.
And he could handle two, so why couldn't he handle one more?
You're thinking about the first.
You're too much stock market, Steve. Yes, I think I think what Jesus is trying to say is he's already told them with 5 wise and 5 foolish virgins. He's already told them prepare because you don't know when he's coming back. So while you're in that preparation stage, use what you got for the glory of God. Because then I think the application to all of this may be the rest of the chapter where he talks about helping people, doing for people, doing what you can. And so it all fits together. That's what I say. We often see the Bible as disjointed, that there's no connection. You just go from you study the parable of the 5 wise and 5 foolish virgins, and then the next week you study the parable of the talents, and you don't connect the two. But it was all an answer, and it's all a connection. I've been thinking about if it would be of benefit, and I don't know that it would, so I kind of need some response. But in class, and it would take us a few weeks to try to just present an overview of the Bible, a general overview of the Bible and what's going on. I don't know that I think y'all are great Bible students, but I will say this about that. I have often found that when I go back and do it for me, myself, in my personal studies, it just reminds me of things that I did know, forgot.
That's not. I need to give it to the person who has seen.
Yeah.
And what's the translation? Usually you make a translation to life or to heaven or the plan of salvation, like the prodigal son. But it's
Well, for me, it goes back to the very first lesson in this whole series where we just talked about parables, and we stressed the point that every little thing in any of the parables cannot be pushed too far with regards to interpretation. And we can't say, well, 5 talents represents 5,000 years and no. So you interpret, but you have to interpret kind of generally and not too specifically. But yeah, because then Jim's logical, I don't know that he was thinking this, and I don't mean to put words in his mouth, but the logical part of his discussion would be, are there degrees of punishment and reward? I don't know that you were thinking that, but that would be where the theologian would run to next. So, anything else? Okay. Well, next week we're going to study the parable of the rich fool found in Luke 12. If you want to get ready for that. It's a short parable, so we may study a couple of parables, but we'll start there next week. I'll have your outlines. I've already got them ready. Matter of fact, they're up here. Anything else? Well, we thank you, and we hope you have a great week. Let's bow for a word of prayer, please. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this day, thankful for the opportunity to study your word, thankful for your word and what it means to us, and for the fact that it is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. And we're mindful of the fact, as we studied this morning, of the coming of your Son and the judgment that will take place at that time. And help us to be prepared. Help us to use what we have, to constantly evaluate ourselves and our abilities, and use those things, those abilities and those talents and what we have for your glory and for your good. Watch over us, be with us, bless us, and hold us as we hold to you. For this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a wonderful week. See ya.